I'm sitting in my garden, surrounded by new growth, basking in the sun, when I see a white butterfly fluttering through the air and land in front of me. We lock eyes, and I'm seething. There lands my foe. Come hear about our long-standing feud and also some things butterflies taught me about writing code. I'm Sweta Sanghavi. I'm a developer at BackerKit. I'm also a proud tender of earth in sunny Berkeley on a lonely land. Today, we're going to talk about how careful observation and patience can be pivotal in both gardening and writing software, and talk about a few times I didn't have either. I'm going to first walk you through some examples in the garden and then the reflections they led in code. We'll end with some tools that has helped me implement these lessons on my day-to-day. Cut to this past spring. My friend asked if I wanted her extra veggie seedlings. At this point, I had no space of my own for them, and I hadn't grown anything edible since I left a basil plant on a radiator all winter, but I dreamed of stepping out into my lush garden and picking out whatever was in season for dinner. After some light persuasion of my boyfriend, we were back with 12 solo cups of seedlings. I quickly repotted them, and we were off. Y'all, I was committed to making my babies thrive. I read and worried about things like hours of direct sun, how often to water, the NPK ratio of different fertilizers. And as an avid Stack Overflow reader, I found gardening forums to post all my beginner questions. How do my plants look? Could I expect a bountiful summer harvest? Well, the comments I got spanned from, that's a lot of information, that's a lot at once, to information about how my veggies were growing. You may notice one common theme. My friends from Garden Stew agreed. My pots were too small to grow the flavorful veggies I was looking for. Hank says, I agree with Mart. Plant your veggies directly into the ground if you can. It's time to give the roots more space. The thing is, as I alluded to before, this wasn't my backyard, and I didn't have space for even larger pots, nor could I transplant my plants into the soil. I thought, if I got everything else right, I could make this work. These are all direct quotes to show you how kind, informative, and downright funny gardeners are. Meanwhile, I diligently watered and I waited. One day I was checking in on the growth of my squash blossoms and went on to water my kale. Well, as you can see, my kale leaves had always been full of character. A little crinkled, a little misshapen. But this time I did a double take. It's like that character morphed in front of my eyes into holes. And they were everywhere. I go into a slight panic. What was causing these? Did the roots not have enough space to grow? And was this impacting the leaves? Well, I took my problem to the people. My friend Brad said it looked like I had caterpillars that were feasting on my kale. I'm going to be honest, I didn't think that's what it was. I had looked at my kale every day when I watered it. I would have noticed caterpillars. And I was still thinking about my crowdsourced advice about the small pot size. But I humored Brad and went to take a closer look. And at first glance, as I thought, I didn't see anything. But then I saw something moving. And then I saw multiple things moving. Wriggly foes just munching away on my kale. I didn't realize we were on a true debugging mission here. I was pretty bewildered. As committed as I was to growing healthy kale, I didn't notice multiple caterpillars on them. Well, I moved the caterpillars onto a different plant, and we keep moving towards our dream garden. Except it gets worse. And I look again, and there are more caterpillars. How is this possible? I thought back to a quote I had read by Pam Pierce in Golden Gate Gardening. Make a conscious effort to look at your garden, Look to spot problems in time to solve them. Look to develop a feel for the plants, how they grow and how they react to stress. Turn leaves over, notice what's flying or crawling about. Sit down and study a plant or a square foot of ground until you've learned something new. Well, I sat down in the dirt and took Pam's advice. I took a look at the soil. I turned over a leaf. I held it in my hand and looked closer, under the leaves, to find some white specks. Specks I certainly would not have noticed while watering my kale. Sweta, you don't just have caterpillars, you have eggs. And then a memory flashed into my head. I'm drinking coffee in my garden. I'm watching the hummingbirds and butterflies fly around, and I'm like, I'm really doing it out here. These beautiful butterflies were the culprits. They were laying the eggs that were hatching caterpillars that were eating the kale. I planted kale for me to eat, not these adorable caterpillars. And it wasn't just enough to move the caterpillars, I had to remove the eggs from my kale. This experience is fertile ground for some lessons in and out of the garden. It's a reminder of how the unknown or weakest part of the system is not necessarily the root of the undesired behavior. I was so fixated on solving the problem of the holes and then of the caterpillars, never to dig into the root of the problem, the butterflies that were laying the eggs. Similarly, because I knew my plants didn't have enough space, it was really easy for me to fixate on that. And that was me carrying forward an assumption that any problems in my plants are going to come from the size of the pots. That focus made it harder to look for the other signals for my system and to look at my plants holistically. While I was looking at my kale every day, I was always looking for something very specific, new kale leaves as I water them from above. It can be so easy to look at something regularly and yet miss some key details about it. I wasn't looking at my kale holistically, looking under the leaves or the soil, nor was I looking at my kale as an element of a larger system, examining the critters that were around it. Perhaps I could have noticed these holes earlier and identified them as bite marks if I'd slowed down to look closer at my kale. And perhaps if I'd examined the whole system of the garden, I could have asked myself the question, why are there more butterflies in the backyard recently? A quieter sign, but in our case, the root of our chewed up kale. This experience taught me the value of a different way of looking, from scanning for signs of progress to being curious about every change that happens and the why behind it, and examining my garden and kale holistically. I thought expert gardeners knew exactly what to do and the right concoction of inputs, the sun, the fertilizer. What I didn't realize is that my crops had something to say back to me, and expert gardeners are just expert observers hearing these signals. And it's not that these gardeners never get pests, it's that they observe them early so they can act quickly. I'd love to tell you that I learned my lesson, but alas. You see, recently I wanted to use my leaf grower to remind myself what the sun requirements of kale was. And so I called fetch and from our new leaf grower, saved it to a variable, and I keyed into sun requirements, only to see this error. And I thought, wait, was it actually a symbol? Wait, was there no underscore in the key? Or do sun requirements not exist on this object? I'm feeling myself wanting to go into debug overdrive. But wait, let's apply our previous lesson. What would it look like to examine our system and to look under the kale leaf? Let's look closer at the error. At first glance, I didn't even really understand this error, and so I reactively changed the key. Well, okay, our error is a type error with no implicit conversion of string into integer. And then we see those square brackets underneath. Oh, right, square bracket is just syntactic sugar for our method that is throwing this error. And the key we're passing is the parameter for this method. Didn't really even think about that when I encountered this. All right, let's think further of the no implicit conversion of string into integer. Well, I guess in this case, the string is the key, sun requirements. Why would we try to convert that into an integer? Well, as I slow down, I consider that also my first instinct was to change the key, but actually, if I were to key into a plant object or a kale object with a key that doesn't exist, we would actually return nil, not an error. That was me following an assumption that the key was wrong. So it's not necessarily what the issue is. I think further, and the integer is still mysterious to me. Why is Ruby trying to take our string, sun requirements, and convert it into an integer to pass back to the square bracket method? Oh man, I think of the other implementation of square brackets, and integers make me think of indices, and it kind of all comes together for me to realize. I thought my method was returning a plant object, but instead it's an array of plant objects. This is one of those funny cases where Ruby is trying to help us out by assuming we meant to call an index because that's what the square bracket for arrays expects, but that conversion bubbles up to an error that we might not expect. I thought back to my lesson from growing kale. It can be so easy to assume that it's the size of my pots, or in this case, the formatting of the key or the key that I'm using. That was the actual issue. And that assumption that I was carrying forward kept me from investigating the caterpillars to find the eggs, or in this case, from fully understanding the error. Both the signals that my system was serving to me. This is a pretty simple example, but it's not an unfamiliar one, and I use this as a stand-in for the many times we react to unknown or unexpected behavior. There are countless times that I had misread a stack trace or misdiagnosed a bug or misunderstood what a line of code was doing just because I totally thought I knew and carried that assumption forward. I think of certain errors that I see frequently that it can be easy to kind of be numb to the specific error and reflexively change what I'm most unsure about. Sometimes it's a mock, I don't feel confident I wrote correctly, or it's a new API that I'm working with, so I'm sure I've misunderstood what the keys are. Often the complexity of the task at hand obscures the simple stepwise process of reading the error fully. So what can we learn about these tricky places we find ourselves regularly? Sometimes these resolve themselves just on a second glance or a simple put somewhere, but how often do we carry these assumptions further, shifting into autopilot mode? I think of being confused by something's erroring and going to check if it's related to a bug that I saw last week, instead of fully even just reading the stack trace and notice where this instance of the error is coming from. I've noticed that when I commit to a practice of observation, of reading the signals and signs of our application, I can save time and frustration. So I ask, what can we learn from our chewed up kale moments and develop an eye for those earlier, quieter hints of things amiss? Well, going back to our gardening adventures, spring turns into summer and summer cools into fall. And lucky for us East Bay growers, we've got a long season of cool weather gardening ahead of us. This time we're going to grow carrots and beets from seed. And another exciting development since we last gardened together, we've got a backyard. So we're going to be growing into the ground. No more cramped pots for us. Hold your excitement. Well, to do this, we need to make some space in the yard for our new vegetables. And so I dig up the weeds growing in a patch of ground, amend the soil with some compost, and then sow carrot and beet seeds. And then we wait. Several weeks pass and some seedlings start popping up. I realize though that some of these are the weeds from before. And since Now that we're growing outside of pots, we're more subject to deeper rooted plants and volunteer plants. Plants from seeds that were moved organically. Think wind or squirrels. The thing about root vegetables is that they need lots of room to grow those thick roots. And when they're crowded, their growth can be stunted. I wanted to protect my carrots and beets from other root systems growing too close to them. And to do that, I knew I had to diligently weed, but I didn't know how to tell apart the plants I wanted versus the weeds that I didn't. Well, to answer this question, to a new gardening group we go. Hera says, I'd wait until those sprouts are big enough to actually ID before starting to pull weeds. I thought that the gardeners that I queried would point out what to keep and what goes, but I sense we're getting a bigger lesson than just the task at hand. Seedlings look alike when first sprouted, and time needs to pass before we know if the seeds we planted belong where they're growing. Hera also asks us a question with, what is a weed? At the end of the day, weeds are just plants, and I realize I was labeling anything that wasn't a sprout from the seeds I'd planted a weed, labeling anything I didn't expect as a weed. Well, what was the cost of deeming growth I hadn't predetermined to grow in my garden patch as something that didn't belong there? When we dictate what grows and where based on expectations, we're letting those expectations guide the growth of our garden instead of the seedlings themselves, and we lose the possibility of organic growth that can benefit our garden in ways we couldn't have predicted. By weeding my garden before I even knew what I had or how this new growth would interplay with my beets and carrots, I lost the possibility of volunteers and other great additions to my garden. So waiting to see what I was sprouting allows me to instead be dictated by the health of the seedlings or the utility they serve instead of just what I was expecting to see. Naturally, I thought about the seedlings we plant in our code. When we build our applications on predictions, we similarly lose this benefit of organic growth. Do you know that butterflies that lay eggs on my kale, those same butterflies hate the smell of thyme, and planting thyme by your kale can help deter those butterflies from laying eggs. Here's the other gift Hera gifted us. Let your seedlings grow to find out what needs to be weeded. Great software is not built, it is grown. Let's dive into an example. Well, we have a new requirement. We need to import new data from the plants API and that are leaves, and we need to store those leaves locally, and we also need to associate them with existing stems in the database. So we've got to fetch leaf objects and associate them with stems. The first question is, what's the entry point? Where are we going to plant our new code? One option is the root grower, an existing service where we fetch roots from the same API and attach them to stems. There's already a lot of code that we're going to need, like code to instantiate the connection with the API, to grab existing stems from a database and iterate through them to set those associations. I could imagine adding some code simply into that existing service. We can add some new code to this existing service so that we first are attaching the roots and then attaching the leaves, our new requirement. So let's think of the trade-offs from this approach. It's probably just a few lines of code, a change in an existing file. We'll probably get our feature into the hands of the users really quickly. Well, what are the downsides? Now, the attaching of the leaf and the attaching of the root are coupled actions. So we're going to have to follow the existing order of operations and be coupled to the timing and architecture of that existing root grower. We'll also be adding some complexity to our root grower to the root grower. So now our root grower is also going to have to know how to grab leaves and how to associate them with stems. Well, Another option is to plant a whole new object into our app. This process can feel less attractive because it's adding a lot more code, new files, new tests, etc., including a fair amount of code we already have in our root grower. And now, if in the future, if we wanted to make an update in, let's say, the code that connects to the specific API, we're going to have to make it in multiple places. So this can feel like some downsides, but what is the flexibility this is going to give us? Well, now, sprouting this new class will allow us to decouple our new feature, the growing of leaves, from our growing of roots. This will allow us to let this new feature we're planting develop independently from that previous feature. And we can let the organic forces of our application, bug fixes, feature additions, adjacent refactors, grow our seedlings. Letting this object grow can reveal the abstraction that connects these two services, instead of coupling them by just adding to the same place. Taking this concept further, we could even plant two new objects, one to fetch the leaves and the other to associate the stems. We could even add two different triggers that are not automated like the previous service and worker was. Let's say two different buttons that our users will push. Previously, we had to attach the leaves right exactly where we were attaching the roots to take advantage of some of that code that was already there. For example, to be at the iterating of the stems. Well, instead, if we had two different buttons, each connected with each of these triggers, we could have two different places where our users could control this feature. And it can seem like a downside because now the user has to click two buttons instead of getting stems with leaves already attached. And it introduces a new place for bugs, but it could be really powerful to wait to automate. Our users are part of our system and they reveal information about the way in which they choose to use our new features. That information would be lost if we dictated when this data would be fetched. This method of planting new objects into our code base also allows us to leave some seams in our application. A seam is a place where you can alter behavior in your program without editing that place. So creating two different objects with different call sites allows us to create seams for each of these behaviors. A seam can serve as an entry point and delineation of a separate feature and could also be a seam towards code that's more likely to change. So one that lets us go in and out. Leaving seams where we plant seedlings allows us to have an edge around a flexible, decoupled object that can adapt to our changing requirements. Through this process, we let the abstraction grow out on its own. Maybe we'll find that the abstraction that's most useful is the piece that's actually attaching to the stems. We really see this approach shine when the next requirement comes in. Instead of squishing into the same object as our root grower, we can have different seams to consider and choose from. This can be a really good framework for approaching legacy code. When we add to code that already exists, we can ask what refactors are necessary to leave seams where they did not exist previously. This technique really drives home the point that Sandy Metz has made previously of duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction. And when we build modular objects into our app, each can grow and evolve in the wild of our application. And as objects grow towards each other, we can make abstractions that make sense and that were made in reaction to our growing needs, instead of because where we happen to couple our code together or because code looks similar. This process can really avoid premature refactors or coupling features based on implementation and let our seedlings grow to tell us which refactors our application needs. I wanted to show you what happened in my case, which is 3 weeks later, I was sure this seedling was definitely a beet, only to find out I was wrong. And I show this for y'all because one of the harder parts of waiting to weed or transplant your seedlings is you have to keep around seedlings you're not sure about. In one word, patience. The difficulty of this philosophy, shared between code and gardening, is that it can require discipline to let a plant grow larger and become harder to move when we're unsure it belongs where it is. And when we revisit code that we know is still growing, it can take discipline to leave it there and wait for new sprouts to inform your abstraction. Action can feel easier than letting time pass and let our garden grow. But it does bring up an important question of when to refactor. When we have different objects, each with their own call site, it can result in code that could look duplicative or redundant. A simple rule of threes where you wait until you have 3 different places doing the same thing can serve you well. For me, the more powerful idea has been that the bigger mistake is to refactor too early. Wait to see what your seedlings are before you weed. Let's talk about some tools that could be helpful. For me, the biggest skill that has served me is an awareness of a very specific feeling. Close your eyes. Picture that it's 4:30. You are been solving a bug all day and you're inches from a solution and you know you're missing something obvious. Perhaps imagine the last time you were there and think, are you listening to your application, reading errors fully, being thoughtful about what changes you make to your code? You can open your eyes. To me, this is all about identifying that feeling and throwing tools at it. That's the place we don't want to be. And we want tools to reset from that place. Well, the first tool I'll offer is to talk to your plants. In general, incorporate the practice of stating assumptions. And by its nature, this has the power to naturally slow you down. When we're working, that can mean things like saying out loud how we expect our test to fail, stating what hypothesis we're testing while debugging. For example, I wonder if the variable is not being set correctly in the controller. Let's go check out that file. It can mean reading each error out loud, the method that threw the error, and working up the stack trace in a stepwise manner, or even asking the question, what question are we answering right now? These practices and the slowing down that follows can be a really good antidote to that panic feeling. This could be useful in both pairing and soloing with your rubber duck. I've had pairing sessions where my pair and I grew increasingly confused by a bug, each wanting to quickly try hunches, grabbing keyboards. And while it can feel like we're getting to the bottom of something, honestly, more often than not, this is us spinning our wheels. And it's usually the kind of dynamic that leads to testing far out theories that would have been quickly invalidated if we had looked a little closer. I've also had times where I was confused by some code and I brought in a pair, and then I was frustrated because my pair made me start at the top and step through each piece of the code path. However, those seemingly not useful practices, because I totally know where the issue is, often bear the most fruit. These practices unearth assumptions at the root of most bugs. So shifting coding dynamics to being more open, to being slowed down, and holding ourselves to strive for the force that goes back to the simplest thing can be really useful. Practicing the stepwise approach on the regular will make it be one that you're more likely to turn to when it's more of the frustrating spots. The second tool I'll offer is walk in your garden, as Pam told us to do. One way to do that is to adopt the practice of daily diff into your dev process. At BackerKit, we spend the 15 to 20 minutes after stand-up reviewing the commits of the last day to familiarize the team with all the changes that are happening in the code base. This serves to surface the areas of the code base that are changing, which informs ongoing feature work, or also when we notice any unexpected behavior that either we notice or users report, or really helpful in triaging some exceptions that our app is throwing. It's really not uncommon for me to say, I think we saw something about that in daily diff. It also serves as a great way to zoom out on all the sprouts that are growing in our code base and watching them change. It gives us an idea of the patterns through our app. Now, for larger teams, this may not be a 15-20 minute exercise if you want to review all the commits from the day before, but there may be some cuts you can make, whether it's commits for a product or an epic or from certain teams. Perhaps labeling commits to review the next day could be useful. Another tool that can work is just a time box of reviewing however many commits you get through in 15 to 20 minutes. Just a general awareness and surfacing of the changes can be really useful. And the last tool I'll offer is weeding. And I know I asked y'all to be thoughtful about what you label as weeds, but some parts of our garden are more weed-like than others. What I'm talking about is noise in the form of deprecation warnings, console errors, and lagging. And these can sprout up in your terminal or the console that's running your tests or CI, and can be tempting to ignore. It can be really easy to build a tolerance to that noise and then not notice when you've committed a new one into the code base, or not notice when there's an error while you're working on a feature. Worse, sometimes these are warnings of upcoming changes to gems and other dependencies, and it can really hurt to get the rug pulled out from under you when it's no longer a warning and it's an error. There's a question of when to tend to these. I'd say as soon as you see them, building that practice of taking that detour to solve them there, or at least put a ticket if some investigation reveals it'll take longer, can lead to keeping your garden as close to weed-free as possible. If you're in a place where there's a lot of noise already, one effective tool is to just make a ticket for each one and committing to, let's say, 20% of each sprint to paying down that debt. Well, I want to thank you for coming to Growing Software from Seed. This is a beet seedling that the butterflies have yet gotten to. Let me know if you end up trying something different on your team or in your garden. There's my Discord nickname and my Twitter handle and my email, and I'll be checking this channel through RailsConf. I wanted to give a shout out to BackerKit, where I get to explore these ideas and more with my team. At BackerKit, we make some rad things for creators and crowdfunding. We strive to grow both our code and our people, and we're currently hiring for both a dev and a designer position. I'd love to tell you more. All right, y'all. Thanks again. Have a great time.